Poor woman, she's a victim. Yeah, she's a hot victim.
Throughout history, men have generally not been taken very seriously as victims, for to be a victim is so often seen as not being a man. Instead, male victims, and specifically male victims of DV or IPV, have been openly ridiculed for the crime of just being a male victim, of being a joke in the eyes of society. In parts of medieval Europe, there was a practice known as charivari, in which a man was seated backwards on a donkey and paraded around town to be publicly humiliated as punishment, not for abusing his wife, but for having been abused by his wife. In some areas of England, there was a similar practice of men being placed in carts and shamed for the same crime: victimhood. While women certainly have been punished brutally for any number of domestic crimes throughout history, including husband beating, which occasionally had the same punishment as the beaten husband, being paraded around town and humiliated, being a male victim of IPV has long carried a specific stigma of being antithetical to masculinity. Perhaps there is no better example of a modern parading of the donkey in the public eye than the social destruction of Johnny Depp due to the allegations of his ex-wife Amber Heard, who has accused him of some truly heinous abusive behaviors, beginning with allegations in 2016 and later in an op-ed that she penned for the Washington Post in 2018. Despite not mentioning Johnny explicitly by name in the op-ed, no reasonable person could be confused as to who the perpetrator of the vile violence that she describes could have been besides JD. The story, released during perhaps the height of the Me Too movement, exploded, with other outlets jumping on the donkey's back, including The Sun, which overtly described Depp as a wife-beater, a claim that the UK courts would uphold as, quote, substantially true in a case that JD brought against The Sun for defamation in 2020. In addition to losing that case, Johnny lost nearly everything in Hollywood, being ostensibly blacklisted from Tinseltown, losing his roles in the Pirates of the Caribbean and Fantastic Beasts franchises, while Amber continued to work in the industry, seeing large success in her role as Mera in Aquaman and the DC Cinematic Universe. While previously, every film that she had starred in as a leading role had been a critical or a financial flop. Moreover, her op-ed was written by the American Civil Liberties Union, for which she was described as an ambassador for women's rights, coinciding, surely just by happenstance, with the release of the first Aquaman film, garnering many eyes towards the subject of Johnny Depp's allegedly heinous behavior, with little mention of any wrongdoing on Amber's part, who surely was just engaging in some method acting in preparation for her role as Aquaman's love interest Mera by assisting in the removal of Johnny's middle finger to be more akin to the once hook-handed king of Atlantis.
I'll sing you a song of the sea. We catch 'em and freeze 'em quick as can be.
And those actions? Well, according to Amber, they were truly horrific, resulting in multiple broken noses, being cut with glass, beaten over and over again, and most harrowingly, being, well, let's just say bottle-racked. The claims are beyond severe, but as more information regarding these cases came out, it seemed that even if all of the claims were true, Amber was also potentially abusing JD as well, allegedly breaking a large glass bottle on his finger as previously alluded to, the tip of which did indeed need to be surgically removed, and was recorded admitting that she had hit him.
I didn't punch you, by the way. I'm sorry that I didn't hit you across the face in a proper slap, but I was hitting you. It was not punching you. Babe, you're not punched.
Don't tell me what it feels like to be punched.
You know, you've been in a lot of fights, been around a long time. I know. Yeah.
No, when you fucking have a close
You didn't get punched. You got hit. I'm sorry I hit you like this, but I did not punch you.
While evidence of DV on the part of both parties is something that seems more than plausible, at the very least, that evidence does seem to, at the very most, implicate them both. But only one has seen their career burn persistently over the years following the publication of the op-ed, although it does seem as if the Aquaman ship has sailed. While there have been many people who have believed JD was not an abuser for years, starting the hashtag and movement Justice for Johnny, in terms of Hollywood, it was fairly clear that the winds of La La Land were decidedly no longer in Jack Sparrow's sails. One question that this trial and the drama surrounding it over the last few years has raised, however, is can male victims of abuse ever be taken seriously, or are they forced, despite all claims of male privilege that we hear about so often, to always ride the donkey backwards? But first, and because this video is going to deal with a lot of topics and themes that certainly don't bring a smile to my face, hopefully knowing more about the problem may serve as a force for good. And something else that can serve as a force for good is tracking and offsetting your carbon footprint, which you can do by checking out this video's sponsor, Ren. Wren is a service that helps you track your CO2 output using data collected from researchers at UC Berkeley and World Bank. To start, take their quick quiz to calculate your own CO2 footprint and learn some statistics about how you compare to the average person in your country. Once you've calculated your footprint, Wren offers a subscription service to allocate funds to different services that work to mitigate that footprint, so that for the cost of, on average, about 4 coffees a week, you can potentially offset your entire impact. Wren also tracks that impact, providing you with a personal profile to see how you're having a positive effect on the environment and help to reduce your influence, giving you monthly project updates, all with a 100% guarantee that your subscription goes to where it's needed to reduce your impact, using peer-reviewed research. If you're concerned about our Earth, or just want to cut down on your footprint because of the increasing costs of gas and consumer goods, then check out Wren and calculate your own CO2 footprint absolutely free, and consider subscribing using one of the existing plans or by setting up your own. Additionally, the first 100 people who sign up will get 10 extra trees planted in their name. So if you're interested, consider signing up and let's get those extra trees planted. Thanks so much to Wren for sponsoring this video and providing a way for us all to help reduce our impact on the planet and contribute positively to the health of this one world that we all have to share. And speaking of contributing positively, although the media storm around the Depp Heard trial has been certainly unpleasant, hopefully something good will come out of it by increasing awareness about male victims. And to further increase that awareness, let's start this video by examining the male victim experience. Before we go forward though, I do just want to let you guys know ahead of time that these are some pretty heavy topics we're about to discuss, and the way that I deal with both heavy topics and making statistics more palatable is through humor, much in the same way that it seems Johnny Depp does.
It was so outside. It was so bizarre. And so grotesque that I could only laugh.
For that reason, and because certain words are just not YouTube friendly, I will be using acronyms and censoring some words so that this video is accessible to everyone who needs to see this information. If you feel comfortable with that, then let's get ready and dive into the data on the male victim experience. Although it is perhaps unquestionable that IPV has gone both ways for pretty much all of human history, it wasn't until quite recently that academic and psychological attention has been paid to male victims and actually questioned that notion. Does it go both ways? With the first small-scale study that really looked at the concept conducted by Suzanne Steinmetz in 1977, wherein she suggested that both sexes tend to perpetuate these behaviors, but that men tended to underreport compared to women, and was met with derision both from fellow academics and from the media. Her in-depth interviews conducted with 57 families with 2 or more children were illustrative that more than 60% of couples reported some form of marital violence. In this report, she found that while men tend to cause more damage due to greater, on average, physical strength, women can absolutely commit IPV, do not tend to have better impulse control as previously hypothesized, nor do they tend to be more verbal than men are in fights. In a review of the extant literature, including several of her own studies, another report from Steinmetz, 1977b, found many forms of DV were used equally by both sexes, and that the overall reports of violence were comparable in most assessments. These findings shocked much of the nation when Steinmetz published the results of her research in a pop psychology book, The Cycle of Violence, in which she estimated that at least 250,000 American husbands were severely thrashed by their wives every year, extrapolating that number from her sample of 540 interviewees based on the statistical prevalence within the sample of male underreporting. The findings were printed in a Time magazine piece and saw coverage in several local newspapers, including the Chicago Daily News, and even made headlines as far afield as Norway. Women could abuse their husbands just as men abused their wives? The idea was novel. Dr. Steinmetz's results were also quickly met not just with interest, but with skepticism and even outright derision and dismissal. Fields and Kirchner, 1978, both specialists in divorce and family law, provided a response to Steinmetz in the Journal of Victimology, the same journal her research was published in which they emphasized that even if the rates are similar, men are far more extreme in their violence, a contention that Steinmetz actually completely agreed with in her own analysis and book. That men rarely suffer any financial consequences for leaving their wives, may be arguable in 1978 when fewer women were in the workplace, although a 1988 report from the U.S. House from Esther Wattenberg, then professor at the University of Minnesota's School of Social Work, instead contended that separation economically negatively affected both partners. And finally, Fields and Kirchner concluded that Steinmetz's work was, quote, a disservice to all battered spouses. Well, if there's anyone you know you can trust in matters of gender parity, it's a divorce lawyer. Just look at who the richest women on Earth are and see how they earned their fortunes. Despite the criticisms, Steinmetz' work continued, and in a study published by Strauss, Gels, and Steinmetz 1980, they found that while 1 in 8 husbands commit IPV, the rate was similar for wives, and that the majority of cases of IPV involved violence originating from both parties, with 27% of men being the sole perpetrators compared to 24% of women who were sole perpetrators. Further, of those spouses who engaged in any IPV, 47% of husbands were severely violent 3 or more times a year, while 53% of wives were severely violent in that same time frame. Again, Steinmetz was finding that men and women tend to victimize their spouses in similar frequencies, and once again, this information was not well received. In 1983, Pagelau published her own response to Steinmetz's body of work, criticizing her data extrapolation to apply to broader society, her use of aggregate data rather than coupled dyads, her focusing on percentages of violent acts rather than severity of violent acts, and further, Pagelau conducted her own review of the prevalence of IPV, officially reported on by men, and found that statistically, men were never victims. Not sometimes, statistically, never, not once. Of course, in the latter case, that would be because, as Steinmetz's own research was designed to assess, men don't tend to report being victims of DV, hence why Pagelau couldn't find confirmation in the public records. It just seemed that everyone so riled up by Steinmetz's studies struggled to actually be able to read them.
Brett the lawyer, a denial correlation. What does that mean? Pretty good. That's close.
Ultimately, Pagelau concluded that the issue of battered husband syndrome, as Steinmetz had described it, was, quote, much ado about nothing, indicating that at least in the 70s and 80s, the very idea that men could be victimized in similar ways as women could be was seen as absurd, even in academia, among both men and women. But this whole academic controversy occurred nearly half a century ago, so what do the numbers look like a bit more currently? Spoiler alert, it's not great. In a report to the Australian Institute of Criminology, Birknell, Boxall, and Andrzejewski, 2014, conducted a literature review and examined the prevalence of any sort of domestic assault that occurred in New South Wales. They found some differences in the profiles of male and female victims, with men being more likely to be assaulted by a stranger, for the assault to involve alcohol, and to have been assaulted in public. Male victims tended to experience angry and anxious feelings, fear of re-victimization, and the court process, increased consumption of alcohol and illicit drugs, becoming non-responsive, withdrawn, agitated, or impatient, experienced feelings of shame or a sense of uselessness, and also experienced isolation from friends and family. Shame was very common among these victims, as was a belief that what had happened to them was perfectly normal, perhaps not wanting to see themselves as the victim. According to the Australian survey data, 52% of men did not report an assault compared to 45% of women. 16.5% thought the event was too trivial to report compared to 11.7% of women. 8.4% of men thought there was nothing the police could do, while 4.2% of women believed that the police would be of no help. But only 0.9% of women thought the police would be unwilling to help, compared to 2.5% of men. Data from the US were similar, with 55% of men not reporting compared to 49% of women, with 22% stating that it was not important enough to report compared to 14% of women who did not believe it was important. While both men and women were worried that the police would not be able to help them to equal degrees, women were far more likely to fear reprisal or of getting the offender in trouble than were men, being reported by 22% of women compared to only 8% of men. In other words, then, men seemingly are less likely to tell authorities about any kind of assault, and that decision may be based on a feeling that said violence was not important and potentially influenced by feelings of shame that men experience uniquely when thinking of themselves as victims. But do men have a good reason for feeling that way? That their experiences are not serious and need not be reported? An early study on the subject back during the row between Steinmetz and Pagelau, debating the very existence of male victims of IPV from Smith, Pine, and Hawley, 1988, compared social judgments of victims of, well, the R word that I can't say because it's just not YouTube friendly. Even though this is kind of important information and I wish I could talk about it like an adult, but alas, we can't. University students were exposed to a supposed legal summary of a faux case, Barnett/Danridge versus the state of Washington, wherein either a male or female plaintiff's car broke down on the side of the road and was picked up by 2 male or female defendants, offering him or her a ride into town. Shortly after getting into the defendant's car, the driver pulled off onto a deserted road, stopped, and pulled a firearm on the victim and demanded that he or she strip before forcing sexual acts on them, then leaving the victim alone in a field with just their clothes. Subjects were asked about the guilt or innocence of the defendants, how they should be punished, the responsibilities of the victim, and the sexual pleasure experienced by all parties. Gross.
Did it feel good though?
They found that female subjects generally tended to give more stringent sentences when the defendants were men, and in general, male defendants were suggested longer sentences by all participants. Respondents believed that forced sex acts were more likely to have occurred when the victim was female than when the victim was male. Male victims were seen as being the most likely to have encouraged the sexual behavior when the assailants were female, and while male respondents believed victims of both sexes were more likely to have done something to spur on the attack, they specified that male victims were the most likely to have provoked the sexual behavior when the female assailants targeted a male victim. While both men and women reported that male victims of female assailants felt the lowest levels of stress and the most pleasure themselves, compared to all other combinations of the victim-perpetrator dynamic. While women also believed that a man assaulted by women would likely experience less stress and more pleasure than in any other scenario, the degree of this difference compared to all other scenarios was much smaller than it was for male participants, indicating men tended to perhaps be the most likely to dismiss male victim suffering at the hands of women. Things haven't seemingly changed a whole lot since the 80s either, as we can see in research from Silaxa and Walter, 2014, who provided college students with one of 4 vignettes which depicted an IPV scenario wherein the perpetrator was male or female and the victim was male or female, meaning this analysis also included homosexual dyads. Subjects read about a supposed friend, either Josh or Julie, who had recently been fighting more frequently with their romantic partner, with that partner accusing Josh or Julie of infidelity and throwing things around the room. Recently, Josh or Julie appeared to have bruises on his or her arm and a cut on his or her face. Subjects were then asked their opinions regarding the seriousness of the situation, who was responsible, and what they might do in response to such a scenario. For male subjects, seriousness was negatively related to perceptions of victim responsibility and intention to ignore the situation. That is, the more severe men believed the situation to be, the less likely they were to see the victim as in any way responsible for said situation. Further, for males, seriousness was positively related to intentions to encourage the victim to seek help, and intentions to encourage help-seeking was itself positively related to intentions to talk to others about that situation. Encouragement of the victim and speaking to others were both negatively, understandably, related to intentions to ignore the situation, again in males. There were 2 significant correlations for female subjects, positively between seriousness and encouragement of the victim to seek help, and between encouraging the victim and talking to others about the incident. There was no difference in perceptions of seriousness of the problem, but female participants tended to view all victims as less responsible. Scenarios involving a female victim were seen as more serious, and subjects believed these victims were less responsible for the event than they believed male victims were. Situations where women were the aggressors were seen as less serious, but the sex of the perpetrator did not influence perceptions of responsibility, only the sex of the victim. Of all scenarios, respondents believed that the vignette describing a male perpetrator and female victim were the most serious, and the female perpetrator/male victim vignette as the least serious. That is, of less concern than when both partners were male or when both were female. Male on female aggression, then, is seen as the most serious of all forms of IPV. Concerning what respondents said they would do were they faced with such a conundrum in real life, researchers found that participants were more likely to report that they would ignore the situation when the participant was male, when the victim was male, and when the participant perceived the victim as more responsible for the behavior. Female respondents and those who saw the situation as more serious tended to be more likely to say that they would encourage the victim to get help. Additionally, women were more likely to report that they would talk to others about the event. Women gossiping? What an unfathomable finding.
And they have this book, this burn book, where they write mean things about all the girls in our grade.
What does it say about me?
You're not in it.
Those bitches.
As such, these results are indicative that both men and women tend to believe that abuse of a male is less serious, and that a man who has been abused is more responsible for that abuse that befell him. Meanwhile, men tend to also see DV as more serious and suggest more actions be taken to try and seek justice, or at least assistance, comparatively to women when it concerns female victims. In other words, men simp for women far more than women do. If the seriousness of female-on-male DV is seen as minimal compared to that of male-on-female DV, how might those perceptions then reflect perceived criminality by potential law enforcement involvement? For answers, we can look to a study from Allen and Bradley, 2017, who exposed college students to a short vignette involving 2 characters of either the same or the opposite sex. In this description, either John or Joanna was described as getting very angry at either Beth or Bill for no apparent reason, swearing at Beth or Bill in front of a group of friends, and hitting him or her hard enough to cause a bruise.
Put that candy back, I'm not buying you all that mess. Oh. Try me, bitch.
Respondents were asked to rate how much injury had been incurred, if John or Joanna had committed a crime, and if the incident should be reported to the authorities. Both male and female participants believed about equally that far more injury was done in the scenario with a male perp and a female victim. While both sexes believed that women aggressors caused less injury, there was a difference here between subjects in that men believed female aggressors were less injurious than did women, indicating that men tend to think that women just aren't capable of causing a lot of damage, at least physically.
Emotional damage!
Using regression analysis to predict how much injury would be attributed based on sex of the involved parties revealed ratings of injury were significantly lower in vignettes involving female violence against men than in vignettes describing male violence against women. That is, both men and women rated female violence against men as less serious, although women saw the male-on-female scenario as the most injurious across all conditions. In terms of criminality, the likelihood a respondent would report the female-on-male incident as criminal was 91% lower than when the perpetrator was male, and violence by women against men had 0.11 times the odds of violence by women of being identified as criminal. In other words, violence by men against women has over 9 times the odds of violence by women against men of being considered to be a crime.
俺は真の男女平等を願う者。都合のいい時だけ女の権利を主張し、都合の悪い時は男のくせにとか言っちゃう輩は許さない人間だ。
Further, both men and women were less likely to suggest that a male victim contact the police than a female victim. Additional modeling illustrated the severity of injury-influenced beliefs that law enforcement should be contacted, with injury explaining 11% of variance, and given that women were seen as having been more injured than men, again, that means more support for women rather than men in contacting the authorities. In the third model, inclusion of the label of criminality increased variance in suggesting involving the police to 18%. And once again, recall that instances wherein a male was the victim were seen as 91% less criminal. Thus, not only do people see male assault as less serious, they're also far less likely to see it as criminal and report it to the police. Even if men are always seen as being more likely to have committed violence against women in a domestic context, does the manliness of that man play any role? Sure, Johnny Depp is a sex symbol, but he's not exactly the most masculine man on earth. He doesn't exude pure distilled testosterone. He's an artist and an actor, not really a heavyweight.
You are without doubt the worst strength build I've ever heard of. But you have heard of me.
Well, Russell and Krauss 2016 assessed the role that masculinity and femininity had on evaluations of a scenario involving SA. The story described a heterosexual or homosexual couple who had lived together for years, were planning on getting married soon, and had never had a public fight. One of the two, David or Jennifer, was described either as a carpenter able to easily lift heavy objects, the masculine condition, or as a compassionate schoolteacher, the feminine condition. One day, David or Jennifer's partner, either Henry or Charlene, was heard screaming and seen being chased by David or Jennifer, holding a knife, threatening to kill him or her, and attempting to break into the car he or she was hiding in. Despite attempts to calm David or Jennifer down, the fight escalated into physical violence, with the two fighting over the knife. University students were told to imagine that they had witnessed this incident play out and that they called the police in reaction to it, and were asked to respond to follow-up questions as if they were reporting on this incident to law enforcement. Subjects were asked to the degree they believed that David or Jennifer should be charged with assault, had threatened bodily injury, and initiated the confrontation, and were also asked to rate the extent to which he or she should be charged. Participants were more likely to say that the male aggressor should be charged than the female aggressor, and suggested harsher sentences for males than females. However, masculinity and femininity influenced perceptions of who instigated the fight and beliefs that the aggressor had threatened bodily injury. More masculine aggressors were seen as more likely to have instigated the bout and more likely to have posed a serious physical threat to their victim. Men who assaulted women received the highest scores for sentence length, however, and means did not significantly differ statistically from women who assaulted men. Men who assaulted other men received the lowest scores, and their mean scores were significantly higher than heterosexual females, but did not differ from women who assaulted other women. In this scenario, then, homosexual couples were always recommended lower sentences than heterosexual couples, whether the aggressor was male or female, although, as before, men who assaulted women were recommended the longest sentences. Further, both men and women who had been described as more masculine, working in a physically laborious occupation and described as quite strong, were more likely to be seen as responsible for the situation. Thus, while men will always likely be seen as more to blame for IPV, particularly feminine men may be less likely to be seen as a threat than more masculine ones. Of course, much like one's sex, most people can't completely control the extent to which they are seen as masculine or feminine. some men are just big guys.
What does she mean by this?
And thus may always be perceived of as an aggressor even if they are the victim. If this is the way that regular people react to scenarios of DV involving female perpetrators, always seemingly being more lenient towards them legally, how does that tendency influence men's proclivity to come forward and tell others about their experiences with IPV, if it just seems so unlikely to people that a man can really not be responsible for his own abuse? To understand more, we should look at male victims' help-seeking behaviors and their experiences with telling their own stories of DV. How do men who have been abused seek help for that abuse? Several studies have examined the specific issue of male victims' help-seeking behaviors in instances of IPV and DV, and the results illustrate that it's not just strangers who would be unlikely to see men as victims, men themselves are also hesitant to do so, as seen in a systematic review of 32 studies from Sang 2015. He found that IPV was typically described as a dichotomy of either common couple violence or terroristic violence, defined as violence specifically against women, which may result in a failure for male victims to be properly taken into consideration. Secondly, women are typically seen as being more seriously injured, while studies rarely examined the psychological effects on male victims, and of those that did assess male psychological harm, most did so only in comparison to the harm reported by female victims. The psychological effects may be of unique concern for male victims, as data from the National Violence Against Women Survey in the US found that the lifetime prevalence rate of psychological abuse for men was 17.3%, which was higher than that for women at 12.1%. While some of the studies in Sang's review did find that women were more likely to be physically assaulted, other evidence is seemingly indicative that prevalence rates are similar while violent behaviors differ. For example, one meta-analysis found that women were more likely than men to throw something, slap, kick, bite, or punch their male partners, while men were more likely to beat up or choke their female partners. A review of data from the Domestic Abuse Helpline for Men, the DAHM, which opened in 2000 from Hines and Brown 2007, found that men most commonly reported being slapped 44%, pushed 42%, or kicked 39%, compared to being choked 22% or stabbed just 2%. The vast majority, 95% of male IPV victims, reported that their partner attempted to control them, most commonly through coercion or threats 77.6%, emotional abuse 74%, or intimidation 63%. Perhaps because of these perceptions and realities, men are more likely to be psychologically abused, and when they are physically attacked, those attacks by women may be less likely to leave symptoms of damage. And it's because of that men also tend to report bad experiences in seeking help from others for the abuse, and often are unwilling to come forward at all.
Would you guys be there for me if I was going through something?
No.
Nope.
Absolutely not.
I hope it sucks whenever you're going through.
For example, Migliaccio, 2001, conducted in-depth interviews with 12 heterosexual men who were abused by their female partners, and found they often tended to refrain from expressing their fears or asking for help so as to maintain their masculinity and avoid ridicule. As Larry stated, quote, "It has become very clear over the past 14 years that there is a tremendous prejudice against the idea of a man being abused by his wife, from counselors, the police, and the media. Facing someone who is laughing at you, the police, or angry with you, counselors, after I'd been abused for hours or days just made me feel more abused." Another set of interviews from Cook 2009 with 30 male victims found that men were often bewildered by the event, believing that hitting back would be wrong, and often running away from the incident rather than defend themselves, hiding from the incidents, feeling ashamed, being afraid of being labeled a wimp, and believing they needed to take responsibility for their children, all of which conditioned their tendencies to not seek help, and something we can see in a lot of the behaviors described by Johnny Depp.
To
avoid talking to me, to
to
avoid
escape
working out. That's
to
the
escape
problem.
the fight.
You don't escape the fight, you escape the solution.
No.
You escape the solution.
No.
You escape figuring it out. We cannot work it out if you run away to the bathroom every time.
Listen to me.
An exploratory study from Tilbrook, Allen, and Deere 2011, conducted in association with the Men's Advisory Network, and yes, the acronym is MAN.
Look, I need an LGBT without the BLT.
Is that food?
Found that the forms of abuse experienced by the male victims were varied. However, a common link between the victims was their denial of abuse, fear of not being believed, perception of the uselessness of the available resources, feelings of shame related to their concept of masculinity, emotional turmoil, and ambivalence, all of which contributed to their resistance to disclosure. Male victims tended to avoid expressing their emotions, making it often difficult for professionals to properly assess the underlying problems, resulting in psychological symptomatology. And data are illustrative of the often unhelpful nature of DV services in assisting men, as we will soon see. Moreover, some men specified that they avoided disclosure because they wanted to protect the perpetrator from getting into trouble. But others noted that even if they were to reach out, no one would believe them. Additionally, when men in Tilbrook's sample did seek help, they rarely found it, with several stating that there were no services for men that they could turn to, and with one specifying that the programs that did accept males, quote, were only geared up to help men who actually abuse women, and so we really can't help you as far as that's concerned. No one out there really wants to listen. Douglas and Hines 2011 found in a sample of 302 American men that 67% reported in their experiences that formal service agencies, hotlines, and police enforcement were not at all helpful, and those services themselves tend to report similar issues but in the opposite valence, that because men see these services as unable to help, they just tend not to use them. Specifically, of men who contacted DV help agencies, 50%, DV hotlines, 64%, and other resources, 43%, were told, "We only help women," with more than 25% instead being redirected to services for batterers, not for victims. What's the logic there? "Oh, hello, I'm a male victim of DV, could you please help me?" And the response is, "No, but here are some other guys who might be able to help you with your woman problem."
What's going on here?
Oh, sir, I'm arrested. Oh.
Additionally, 15 and 16% of male callers reported that they were laughed at by service providers on the phone. Perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects of this inability to find help is that according to Douglas and Hines data, when male victims are able to find help, it actually works. As a regression analysis revealed that for each additional positive help-seeking experience, men were about 40% less likely to abuse alcohol within the previous year. Another survey of 67 agency representatives in the US concerning the perception of said various agencies' willingness to help male victims of IPV from Soy Cheng and Leung, 2010, found that 1/3 of the service providers reported that American men had an impression that the services were for women only, a belief which may further isolate men, but one clearly based in reality. And it's easy to see why this reality would isolate men when we look at some of the reports from men who called the DAHM from Hines and Brown's dataset. One man said he called 11 numbers with no help, while 3 others said that when they sought help, they were redirected to groups for batterers, again, not for victims. The DAHM called several of the agencies mentioned by these men and confirmed that male victims were being redirected to programs for wife beaters, with one agency saying they, quote, send all their male callers there, and another agency supervisor asking the DAHM investigator, quote, why would a man call a helpline if he were not the abuser? Unfortunately, this lack of help and dismissal of the issue has serious implications, as a mother's call to the DAHM illustrates. She recalls how her son was in an abusive relationship, and after finally managing to leave, his ex-wife obtained a restraining order only to frequently charge him with violating it, which ended up costing him so much money, and in doing so much damage to his mental state, he eventually took his own life. When mothers of dead sons are calling the men's domestic abuse hotline to report how the system has failed, then clearly, there's a problem. To get a more detailed look into the experiences of male victims, we can look to a study from Hein, Bates, and Wallace 2022, who conducted semi-structured interviews with 4 call handlers at a UK domestic charity for male victims. These 4 women, who had worked in the field between 21 months and 14 years, were asked about the characteristics of callers, stereotypes and societal beliefs about male victims, barriers to male victims seeking support, and their general opinions towards these experiences. In terms of the stereotypes noted by the call handlers, the researchers identified primary and superordinate themes, which involve the stereotypes and expectations of men as being antithetical to the role of a victim. Men almost always indicated in some form that they simply could not be victims due to the nature of masculinity and their position in society, with Abigail stating, quote,
I have guys that call me and say, I can't be a victim of domestic abuse. How would I be a victim? I am a police officer, I'm a judge, I'm a solicitor, I work in the field, I can't be a victim. Even though they know what is going on, it's like, I can't talk to anyone. I can't talk to anyone local, they say. I can't engage with the service.
In addition to the superordinate theme, 3 overarching themes were also identified, the first of which concerned men's experiences and how they tend to think about it, which itself had 4 sub-themes: the type of abuse, recognizing and accepting, outcome and impact of disbelief and expectation, and outcome and impact of abuse. In terms of the types of abuse, call handlers mentioned many different behaviors, from small tiffs to men having been stabbed, yet avoided going to the hospital while making excuses for their partner's behavior. Abigail also recalled one victim who was financially controlled by his partner. She would take his paycheck and give him an allowance of his own money. Angela also recalled financial abuse as well, with the man being forced to pay for all of his wife's wants while also being the subject of continual humiliation for not being man enough by her. Amy noted that men most commonly reported having things thrown at them as symptoms of physical violence, as well as common false accusations of infidelity and bouts of jealousy from female partners. Trish also stated that a frequent follow-up to the abuse, which leads to it often being cyclical, was for the female partner to be very apologetic after each incident, while the severity of the incidents continued to escalate in severity. The recognizing and accepting sub-theme described men's unwillingness to recognize themselves as victims and accept that they had been victimized. These men expressed fears that they would not be believed, often not believing it themselves, and using the call with the abuse service as a form of validation. Trish described that many men were afraid that they would be mocked and shamed in coming forward, while others were reluctant to seek help in fears that their partner would leave them. The outcomes and impact of abuse sub-theme described by men included isolation, long-term physical problems, poor mental health, and loss of contact with their children, while the outcomes and impact of disbelief and expectations sub-theme described men's reluctance or inability to see themselves as victims, as well as a bias within the court system to similarly not see men as victims either, and deprive them of parental rights. Angela specified that the men she spoke to might describe being a victim as, quote, gay and a threat to masculinity. Family and friends also played a role in male victims' lives, both as sources of advice and in need of protection. Amy reported that she would sometimes receive calls from family asking for advice on how to help their male relative, and lamented her inability to do much to help in these cases without the victim himself coming forward. The call handlers also received messages not just asking for advice from family and friends, but also expressing a desire to protect them. Abigail mentioned how calls from mothers were particularly difficult to respond to, and Trish recalled an emotional gut blow of a call wherein a mother of a male victim who had talked to her several times went silent for a few months, only to call back and reveal that her son had taken his own life, a completely different case than the one mentioned before. The final overarching theme concerned the barriers and challenges faced by male victims when they are able to recognize that there is a problem and that they need help. Angela noted that many men feel they are financially unable to leave, already having obligations to pay usually for the home and the care of their children. She also mentioned that men are often surprised that there even are service centers that will treat male victims, and specified that these services frequently are not clear if they even do. As we covered earlier, these men were not wrong in that perception, and that issue is a whole different can of worms, as Abigail elaborated that there were whole sections of the country wherein there are no shelters for male victims of DV, even while the number of calls to their hotline has increased in frequency over time. And the fears of those men in finding a shelter are well placed, as it wasn't until the opening of the Taylor House Domestic Violence Shelter for Men in Arkansas and the Family Place in Dallas in 2017 that there were any male-only shelters in the entirety of the United States, while in 2018 there were 9 refuge centers for men in the UK where this study was conducted. Thus, perhaps it shouldn't be a surprise that Trish said she rarely gets positive follow-up phone calls from male victims. Very similar results as those found in the interviews conducted by Hine et al. Can be found in an anonymous online survey of men's experiences with and perceptions of societal beliefs about IPV from Bates 2019. Much as with Hine et al.'s analysis, Bates used thematic analysis to identify general trends in the responses of 161 men and isolated 3 major themes, the first of which was the various physical, mental, and relational impacts of the experience. In terms of physical and mental health, men mentioned symptoms such as vision loss as a result of physical violence and PTSD, as well as attempts on their own lives, a feeling that their life was over and that they were all alone. Concerning relationships, men often reported that they felt they could never love, trust, or be in a relationship again, and struggling with intimacy when they did open up, with one respondent mentioning how he would always subconsciously worry that his new girlfriend might be about to hit him whenever she went in for a hug. The impact of DV extended to other relationships outside of the romantic, namely onto children, oftentimes whose mothers were the perpetrators of the abuse. Several men described feeling alienated from their kids, with one saying that being away from his daughter for 2 years was worse than any bereavement or loss he had ever experienced. Outside of the relational, the second major theme included societal perceptions of male victims, including stereotypes of weakness, beliefs that men were always abusers, and the cultural meaning of the very word victim. One subject said that people don't believe him and see him as pathetic and less of a man, while another said that he was seen as stupid for putting up with it. and that being on the receiving end made him weak both physically and mentally. In something of a sad irony, men who come out as victims are often seen as weak, yet many people also doubt that men can be victims, expecting them to always be abusers, with 2 participants noting how their physical size meant no one would ever look beyond the exterior when assessing their victim status. 2 subjects mentioned the media specifically and the common portrayal of men as aggressors, while any aggression on the part of women is resigned to the realm of comedy, being a frequent punchline in sitcom programs.
If there's ever anything wrong, it's PMS, huh? Sometimes I don't know what to do. Sometimes I just want to smack you.
Some respondents also felt uncomfortable with the word victim to describe themselves, seemingly for the same reason that society at large is less comfortable attributing that word to men. It's simply unmasculine, with some preferring the term survivor instead, although anyone who's played Resident Evil Survivor knows that's not necessarily an upgrade. 2 participants placed the blame on themselves, one for marrying his wife in the first place, and the other for not leaving sooner. When asked about the effects of these perceptions of male victim status, depression, low self-esteem, and anxiety were mentioned, as well as, again, being blamed for the relationship and thereby the abuse. One man expressed that he was embarrassed to let others know about what had happened, knowing that others would sneer at him, and it's perhaps for that reason that so few men seek help and even fewer still find it, which leads us conveniently to the 3rd theme, experiences with help seeking and leaving the relationship. Some men received positive reactions from friends and family when they told them about the issue, while others described less positive reactions, with one saying his friends laughed at the story and told him to man up. Others specifically avoided talking to others precisely because they knew that such a response was likely, either in that no one would believe the account of a man being abused by a woman, or because it simply isn't something that men should do, with one subject saying it was something that he thought men just had to deal with. If the responses from family and friends seemed dismissive, the accounts of police response were far more so, with 2 men specifically mentioning that when they called the police, the officers blamed them for the abuse and accused him of having done something to incite it. Others were directly mocked by the cops, laughing at the claims or dismissing the report. According to one account, while in the ICU being treated for stab wounds, a doctor asked one man, quote, "So tell me, did you deserve it, or is she just a crazy bitch?" It's important to note that this was not the case for all men involved in the study, as 2 described the police as being sympathetic and helpful, but as we'll see going forward, that doesn't appear to be the norm. In terms of obstacles faced by men attempting to leave their abusive partner, children were the main sticking factor for several men, either fearing for their safety or fearing that the mother would weaponize the children against them, withholding visitation, or even threatening to make false allegations of child maltreatment to prevent him from legally being able to see them. Others were just still in love with their abuser or committed to the marriage. For those that didn't experience physical violence, one explained that because it wasn't physical, it was just a normal part of life. Some men explained that they knew no one would believe them and stayed in the relationship, with one convincing himself there were no better options. Once again, we see that men tend to be reluctant to come forward with their experiences with DV, and one of the reasons why is because of a fear or concern with how others would react to those experiences. And it seems, based on their reports, those fears are often well placed, with the abuse not being taken seriously even by law enforcement, who by some reports found the very concept of male victims to be laughable. So if men tend to think that law enforcement does not take them seriously, let's find out why by looking at the experiences of male victims with the legal system. It seems that it's common not only for services designed to aid victims of abuse to be unconcerned with the plight of male victims, but also for the police and courts to be less than favorable towards them as well, hence why so many men are afraid to come forward with their stories. In Migliaccio 2001's interview with men who had experienced IPV, Peter explained that in one incident when he requested the police document evidence of his abuse, they simply told him that, quote, "men don't get hit." And during another incident, the officers similarly dismissed him saying, quote, "You gotta be kidding me, buddy. Women don't beat men." For Peter, it didn't stop there, as after sustaining, according to his report, multiple bruises, abrasions, and lacerations, chest wall contusion, and physical trauma, when he asked a judge for a restraining order, quote, "He basically laughed at me. Then he placed a dual restraining order on both of us." Officers who arrived at Larry's home did not consider the possibility of him being the victim, instead physically removing him from the home and arresting him. When Kyle entered the police station bleeding, attempting to file a report against his wife, who admitted to the assault by the way, the police plainly refused to make any such filing. Similar reports regarding the police were present in Tilbrook et al.'s 2010 sample, with one man saying, quote, "The authorities used powers that were very hostile to me. When I would report the violence, the police would laugh at me quite literally. I mean literally. I mean, nobody would take me seriously. I was discriminated against severely. I mean, as I said, I was told to f*** off, or whatever." The police were not the only problem with the law, as another man from Tilbrook's analysis described an equally flippant judge when he sought a restraining order, telling him, quote, "You're a big boy, you can take care of yourself." In terms of raw numbers, data from Douglas and Hines 2011 of men who were willing to contact the police, 41.5% reported the police asked if he wanted his partner arrested, 21% reported that the police refused to arrest the partner, and 38.7% indicated that the police said there was nothing they could do and just left. In total, 25.4% of men told stories of the police doing nothing and ignoring or dismissing them. To get a better idea of the relationship between male victims and law enforcement, Dim and Lisova 2021 conducted 16 extensive interviews with male Canadian victims of IPV regarding their perceptions of the legal system, all of whom had some experience related to DV involving either the police or the courts. The researchers identified 2 themes related to police interaction and 2 related to courts, of which there were several sub-themes. Regarding the cops, the first overarching theme concerned barriers to contacting them for help, of which there were 3 sub-themes, beginning with the sense that men are not allowed to stand up to women. One participant said that he was hesitant to call the police because he believed that they would see it as wrong for a man to stand up to a woman, anticipating they might say something like, "A man like you can't stand up to a woman. What's the matter with you?" Relatedly, another sub-theme involved a perception that the cops would not believe male victims, with several men mentioning that the abuse was verbal and thereby would be difficult to prove. Some of the men interviewed also blamed themselves for the circumstances, trying to understand what they could have done to prevent the abuse. Other men expressed a fear of being arrested themselves or reporting the abuse at all. One man said he knew that his partner would lie and put on a show for the police, so he just never called for help, while another recalled a time when his ex-wife became violent when coming to pick up their children, only for the police to arrive and arrest him, not her. And in some locations, that's a matter of law. It took a year, a court appearance, and the testimony of multiple witnesses for that particular case to be dismissed. Relatedly to the aforementioned story, the second major theme concerned negative experiences with the police, including a perception that they are just against male victims. Participant G recalled once calling the police after his partner hit him and then hid in the background, only to be asked if anyone was in immediate danger, and as he was not, the police replied that there was no reason for them to have come out. 2 subjects specifically mentioned being laughed at by officers, and one while being actively brutalized by a woman right in front of them. You'd think that the police would be experts at domestic violence considering how many of them have been up to it. Several men also expressed frustrations with the legal system, as it seemed there was never enough evidence to justify any police attention for men. One participant said his wife had been given a no-contact order several times, only for the cops to drop the charges within a few days, including one instance wherein the charges were dropped while he was in the hospital with broken ribs. Similarly, respondent I said that the police refused to believe that he was not responsible for enabling or instigating the abusive situation. Interesting how in the case of pretty much no other crime is instigation given so much leeway. Inside the courtroom, one major theme revolved around perceived female abuses of that system, including fears of being set up or lied about, as participant B recounted how he had called the police after his wife was repeatedly aggressive towards both him and their infant son, only for the cops to take her and the child to a women's shelter where she developed a victim narrative and in court accused him of physical abuse, winning primary custody of their son, and with participant B only getting to see him twice a week for 6 hours at a time, supervised. Manipulation of child custody was a common sub-theme, with subject L losing custody even though his wife admitted to abuse because he was deemed physically unfit due to bowel issues. Before participant B even called the cops during a violent episode, he had asked the police directly what he should do in such an instance, and they told him that the next time it happened they would arrest her, but instead, when they showed up, as mentioned, she and their child were taken to a women's shelter. Relatedly, there was a theme among some men that men were automatically guilty in the eyes of the law, no matter the evidence in their favor, and seemingly evidenced by interactions with lawyers. Counsel told participant J that if a man is present during any incident of DV, the cops will determine that he is de facto the perpetrator and arrest him, while participant N's lawyer admitted that he would wait to see which judge would be handling a case involving a male victim of DV, and if the judge had feminist leanings, he would just call in sick, knowing that there was no chance of winning the case. I'm not sure how that's not a grotesque, if not disbarable, offense as a Sixth Amendment violation, but there it is. It seems that men's experiences with both the police and the law give them significant pause in trusting either, and may explain why men are reluctant to report abuse from female partners, because not only are they not believed or even mocked, but because there is a perception of deep favorability towards women in the courts. Another series of in-depth interviews conducted with 5 South African male victims from Barkhuizen 2015 focused on their interactions with the police. Tom recounted one occasion when the police took his abuse seriously, only after seeing, quote, the state of his wife when they arrived, telling her to go to bed or face arrest.
Hell no, you can't go to the bathroom. You know where you can go? To sleep.
He expressed that he was afraid to defend himself because he believed the courts were biased and would rule in her favor, and he would potentially see jail time, a common fear for Toms when it concerns DV.
You know, people always complain about this person and that person. This person makes me feel badly. This person's in the way. This person is stopping me from getting a promotion. I go, you could just kill them, you know?
Tom also stated that his wife was well aware that the police would believe her over him and would accuse him of causing bruises that she herself had sustained while being intoxicated. He also felt embarrassed by the thought of being a victim. Again, another reason why he was reluctant to pursue any action against his abuser. Dick's wife had previously had confrontations with the cops, including one instance where neighbors saw her waving a knife around, and another where Dick was worried about the safety of the children and removed them from the home until the police had arrived and issued her a letter of warning. He said no one would believe him, from the police to the courts to counselors, to the point that he sought out a voodoo doctor to help him, and whom he paid an exorbitant fee. Yet to no avail, obviously.
Besides, you and I both know the real power in this world ain't magic. It's money!
Dick expressed that he was afraid to talk to anyone personally about his predicament and was actually worried that his co-workers would find out and see him as less of a man. Harry also mentioned feelings of humiliation regarding his situation, particularly regarding his wife's public use of profanity. When she would attack him, he would occasionally restrain her until she calmed down, being concerned that she would accuse any defensive act of being abusive, which at one point she did, calling the cops, although the police did not arrest him. Harry was training to be a police officer himself and stated that if he did defend himself, he would likely lose his position, if not end up in jail, stating, quote, "I would never have dared to lift a hand to her. Who do you think the police will believe?" For Paul, evenings after work were met with violent, irrational behavior from his wife, including cutting her own hair, destroying objects, and physically attacking their son, only for her to then call the police and accuse him of DV. She attacked him with their car, would tear at his clothes and attempt to grab and kick his, sensitive area, and was generally out of control. On one occasion when she had called the police, the younger of the 2 on-the-scene officers immediately believed her version of events and left only after Paul showed him a restraining order against her, and even then did not leave until another officer helped explain it to him. During another incident, she had OD'd on medication and became exceptionally violent. Paul called the police to take her to a mental hospital, but between the cops' arrival and Paul packing an overnight bag for her, he found that they had already left without his wife in tow. Oftentimes, when she would call the police, Paul would just drive away to avoid the interaction, but feared leaving his children alone with his wife in that state. He was often intoxicated during these events. Despite the many calls to the police, usually while drunk, the cops never arrested her for the behavior. But the police themselves aren't immune either, as Peter, a retired officer, said of his abuser that, quote, "She knows she can get away with it, and that I would never lay a hand against her," and was afraid that if the police found out about her behavior, he would be humiliated, and thus chose to simply put up with said behavior. Even cops, then, are vulnerable to feeling unsupported by their fellow officers. To better understand the role of the legal system, and specifically the police then, we can look to a study from Stewart and Madron 1997, who investigated police officers' judgment of blame for victims and assailants in cases of DV. 51 male and 46 female Australian police officers were each exposed to one of 8 vignettes, and given the depressing nature of these topics, vignettes that probably made them envious of other officers out on the road, dealing with regular, upstanding members of the Australian public.
And yeah, we're cops, but we're also Australians. And as Australians, we are very impressed when someone is able to drink that much and still get behind the wheel. I would have died if I shotgunned 200 beers, but this gentleman is about as impaired as a toddler that's had too many Chupa Chups. Look at him, he's only wobbling slightly.
In all vignettes, the assailant was male and the level of injury constant. Each described an argument over money between the assailant, Greg, and either his wife, Sam, or his brother, Sam, during an outdoor barbecue. In each case, Greg became irate and began breaking glass and bottles before ultimately striking Sam in the face. In response to the commotion, neighbors called the police, and the cops arrived to find either Greg or Sam both heavily intoxicated. Sam sporting a black eye and Greg appearing unscathed. Officers were asked to rate the level of blame for each of the involved parties and their likelihood of charging Greg with an assault were they to arrive at the aforementioned scene. When Sam was Greg's wife, the police subjects rated her as being significantly less to blame than when Sam was Greg's brother, and similarly rated Greg as less responsible for the violence when he hit his brother than when he hit his wife.
Oh, just two niggas killing each other. Proceed.
Further, the police placed greater onus of blame on Sam when he or she was drunk, while Greg was sober. Police officers were more likely to charge the assailant with assault when the victim was female than when he was male. Although this study doesn't assess female perpetrators, the results are indicative that the police simply do not see male victims of DV with the same kind of respect as they do female victims, instead being more likely to suspect that they bore some responsibility for the abuse and tend to be less likely to charge an assailant who has assaulted a man. A more recent study from Russell 2017 similarly questioned 273 American police officers on their perceptions of a case scenario involving IPV, including perceived culpability of both aggressor and aggressed, likelihood of either inflicting harm in the past and future, credibility, and characteristics of mental illness. Much akin to the scenario used in Stewart and Madron's study, the case officers read in this analysis involved an officer arriving at the scene following a report of IPV to find two individuals, the perpetrator, either Shelley or Bob, and the victim, either Michael or Mary, no longer arguing, but with Michael or Mary presenting with bruises and cuts to the face and neck. Neither demanded an arrest and were polite to the officers. Police subjects in this sample were more likely to consider the victim as a threat to others when the perpetrator of the aggression was female. Yeah, that's right, the officers were more likely to think that the victim was a threat when he had been abused by a woman. Victims of female aggressors were also seen as more responsible for the incident than victims of male aggressors. Heterosexual female perpetrators were the least likely to be perceived of as having physically harmed their partner in the past, while victims of female perpetrators were also considered more likely to inflict harm on her in the future. Generally, victims of male perpetrators were seen as more credible than victims of female perpetrators. Compared to the victims of homosexual and heterosexual male aggression, lesbian and heterosexual female victims were, however, perceived of as being more likely to be suffering from a mental illness as a result of the incident. These findings from these officers seem to be indicative then that male victims are simply not taken as seriously by the cops and are even seen as being a threat compared to female victims, who are generally just not seen as being able to inflict harm and comparatively innocent, credible, and vulnerable. But if that's how the legal system tends to treat men as aggressors and women as victims, what about the cases where a woman is demonstrably the perpetrator of violence and the man, clearly, the victim? It seems that time and time again, women are just not seen as capable of being offenders in the same way that men are. But are they? A meta-analysis of 58 articles from Archer 2002 sought to assess the actual prevalence of IPV behaviors in both men and women, and found that women tend to engage in violent acts just as much, if not more, than men do, but the types of behaviors are different, as women tend to be less likely to use weapons, but more likely to throw things, slap, bite, or push their partner, actions that may be less likely to leave a mark. So if women can be abusers, and tend to be so at about the same rates, if not to the same degree of violence, why is it that they are still so consistently seen as victims even if they are the ones perpetrating DV? One tactic that any kind of abuser may adopt is to play the role of a victim, and given that the wealth of data we've already looked at are indicative that women are believed much more so than men in instances of DV, an easy way for female aggressors to not only get away with their behavior, but even profit socially or financially from their abuse is by reversing the roles, described by deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender roles, or DARVO, which we can understand more about by looking into a study from Harsey and Frade, 2021, across 2 experiments. Participants read 2 vignettes describing an incident of IPV from the first-person perspective of either the victim or the perpetrator, who was either male or female. In half of the perpetrator conditions, the account of the event used DARVO tactics to reframe the aggressor as the aggressed. After reading the vignettes, subjects were asked how believable they thought the victim or perpetrator's story was, how responsible the victim or perp was, and how abusive the victim or perp's behavior was. Participants who read the account from the perpetrator's perspective using DARVO tactics rated victims as more responsible for the abuse and more abusive than those who read the perpetrator's perspective without the use of DARVO. Further, those exposed to the DARVO perpetrator perspective reported that the victim and perpetrator were both less believable. Although female subjects rated female victims as always less responsible and more believable, there were no differences between the sexes in ratings of victim abusiveness, perpetrator believability, and perpetrator responsibility. Participants who read a female perpetrator's perspective accompanied by Darvo saw male victims as less believable, but also saw the female perp as less believable. While men did not see male aggressors using Darvo as less believable, women did, just as they did with female aggressors. A second experiment operated similarly as the first, but this time subjects were exposed to two first-person statements from the perspective of a female victim, Sophia, or a male aggressor, Jacob, concerning an incident of DV. Sophia's version of events described her being forcibly kissed and grabbed without consent, while Jacob's version denied any such behavior and instead suggested that Sophia had been drunk and fabricated the story to damage Jacob's reputation. In the experimental condition, subjects were also exposed to the definition of Darvo after reading the accounts. Respondents were then asked if they believe either actor should be punished for their actions and if they believed that Darvo tactics had been used by either party. 74% of subjects judged Jacob as having used Darvo in his statement compared to 15% who believed that Sophia had. Several participants were not clear, however, with 21% of individuals reporting being unsure if Sophia had used Darvo and 16% being unsure if Jacob had. While men rated the perpetrator as more believable and less abusive, both men and women had similar perceptions of their responsibility. Additionally, while 13.6% of men believed the victim should receive some punishment across all conditions, only 5% of women held the same belief. Those who read the definition of Darvo saw the perpetrator as more abusive and less believable, while seeing the victim as more believable and less abusive, and endorsed lighter punishments for the victim. Although this area of study is still novel, and as such it will take time to fully understand how Darvo may apply to female perpetrators, this study is indicative that Darvo may allow an aggressor to change the narrative of IPV to be more favorable towards their own perspective, by framing themselves as the real victim, and thus paint the victim as the actual criminal. The subject of the blameworthy victim was also assessed by Policastro and Payne 2013 in the context of myths about DV and the criminalization of victimhood. College students were given a battery of questions, probably not the best way to describe it in this context, Aiden, related to their opinions on DV and assistance for victims, and 78% agreed that professionals bore some responsibility for getting help for their clients. Nearly 71% stated that they did not believe victims stayed in relationships because they liked the attention, and more than 95% of respondents indicated that they did not think women should have higher tax burdens due to their greater use of government services.
This action by Councilwoman Nope is nothing more than a thinly veiled government bailout, and I, for one, refuse to let her turn this town into a socialist hellscape. Allow me to elaborate.
93% of subjects indicated that they did not think police services should be based on whether the police had previously been to the home for a prior DV call, and over 93% disagreed with the statement that women who stay in abusive relationships should receive fewer resources. Although 42% believed women involved in relationships typified by IPV should have their children taken away from them by the state, at the same time, nearly 80% of that same sample disagreed with criminal action against mothers who exposed their children to a DV environment. Individuals who believed in myths about DV, including that partners choose to stay in abusive relationships, and did not understand why women did choose to stay in abusive relationships, were more likely to agree that the police could take their time when responding to repeat calls for assistance. In the full model, myth acceptance was the only significant predictor of support for delayed police response and prosecution of mothers for exposing their children to DV environs. Again, only female victims were assessed here, but the data may be indicative that female victims are seen quite positively and sympathetically, despite claims to the contrary, but that myths about DV are influential in perceptions, and we could surmise that might include myths about men being incapable of being victims as well, which we've seen has been a consistent thread throughout the data. If myths can influence one, it's very possible that they influence the other. And on the topic of myths, not only does it seem that, as we've seen in the data over and over, that there is a perception that only women can be victims, and by that logic then there is an equal myth that women can't be perpetrators. A review of data from White and Dutton 2013 found that the most common form of IPV recorded across various surveys was bilateral, that is involving both parties, constituting between 39 and 60% of all reports. In the case of Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, there seems to, at a minimum, have been at least some mutual destructive and even abusive behaviors from both parties. So it's important to not just understand if women can even be accepted as abusers, but also how people look at incidences of DV wherein both sides are contributing to the conflict. To get a better idea of how people react to an aggressive woman in IPV scenarios, and how mutual aggression is perceived of in such a scenario, we can look to Radigan, Stewart, and Moore 2011, who exposed undergraduate subjects to one of 4 vignettes, 2 with a female perpetrator and 2 with a male perpetrator. Participants were asked to imagine they witnessed a domestic dispute between their neighbors, Maria and Robert, in which either party was screaming about a phone call from a strange man or woman, who quickly hung up, with Maria or Robert suspecting infidelity and demanding to know the caller's identity. In the non-confrontational condition, the accused said that they were not sure who called, but suggested it could be someone from their class, to which the accuser responded by demanding an answer and then slapping the other party, telling them it will really hurt next time. In the confrontation condition, the accused replied to the allegation by calling their accuser a bitch or a bastard, and yelled back at them to never answer his or her phone, at which point the story progressed into physical attacks identical to the non-confrontational condition. Respondents were asked about who was responsible or to blame for the situation, and were also questioned about their personal experiences with abuse, both as children and within romantic relationships. Both male and female subjects believed that the female perpetrator was less blameworthy for the conflict than was a male perpetrator, but the confrontational behavior of the victim also played a role in perceived responsibility. Both sexes saw a female and male aggressor as more responsible when his or her partner was not confrontational or insulting. As such, while women perpetrators are always seen as being less agentic when it concerns acts of DV, they are particularly seen as lower in responsibility when their male victim talks back. Additionally, all subjects who had personally experienced childhood physical abuse attributed less blame and responsibility to perpetrators, and particularly to female perpetrators. In contrast, victims of IPV, particularly those who had been physically injured, attributed more blame and responsibility to the perpetrator than to the victim, regardless of confrontational behavior, while in turn, perpetrators of DV attributed less blame and responsibility to perpetrators in the vignette scenarios. Thus, our personal experiences are likely to color our perceptions of the responsibility of both victim and perpetrator in these situations. But even with that in mind, it seems to be a trend that women are just always seen as less responsible, and particularly so if her male partner stands up to her verbally. Additionally, while having been a victim changes how others react to a case of IPV, having been a victim can also change the calculus of IPV in the first place. As data from Hines, Brown, and Dunning 2007, collected from the reports of abused men who called the DAHM hotline, are indicative that, at least in terms of partner report, 92% of female abusers had a history of personal childhood trauma, 62% had previously threatened to end her life, 59% threatened homicide, 52% used alcohol, 46% had a mental illness, and 35% used drugs. Hence, perhaps part of the reason, consciously or subconsciously, why people tend to be so much less likely to see women as perpetrators than men is because they often have been victimized at some point themselves, such as may be the case for someone like Amber Heard, who has a history of childhood trauma. Still, the results of Radigan et al.'s analysis are just perceptions of average people, and while that does matter in a jury trial, it's also important to examine how the law tends to handle female perpetrators of DV, which we can do by looking to a case study from Miller 2009, who conducted interviews with 37 criminal justice professionals and social service providers in Delaware regarding their opinions on women who had been arrested for DV, and utilized grounded theory to identify several themes. The first concerned women's violence, of which not a single participant believed was increasing in rates, although Miller's data confirmed that, in fact, it was, and instead explained that the increases in women's arrests was just a result of ladies fighting back against DV. A prosecutor described this behavior as women simply not being able to take it anymore, while the Deputy Attorney General stated that even if both parties were involved in a verbal fight, the man has all the power, saying, quote, "He's the dominant figure, he controls everything." Yeah, the Deputy AG actually said that. Members of the prosecutor's office actually referred to women arrested for DV as victims and not as perpetrators. Multiple subjects did not even address that the aggression was mutual, but instead described women's violence as an excusable necessity. Probation officers suggested that women often resort to the use of drugs and alcohol to help cope with abuse, certainly further excusing potentially exacerbatory behavior. So, in the minds of these officers, it wasn't that arrested women tended to get intoxicated and become violent, but that they became intoxicated as a method of dealing with their partner's violence. Many also said that the police tend to be overly cautious when it came to instances of IPV, with a shelter worker explaining that if the cops see any signs of physical violence, they're going to charge it, even if the mark came from the actual victim fighting back, and that was the real reason for the increase in arrest rates for women in instances of DV, essentially punishing the victim, from her perspective. Only a few respondents indicated that even if a woman had committed a crime, that she should be arrested the same as a man. The second theme Miller identified concerned men and backlash to the criminal justice system, including the idea that men are the ones who are abusing it and using the law as a cudgel with which to further beat their wives, with the head of the domestic violence unit indicating, seemingly, that if a man calls for help and is calm when the police arrive on the scene and his wife is hysterical, it's because he just got done beating her. Others, such as one family court supervisor, had been told by women that men would cut themselves just to ensure that she would get arrested too, a sentiment reiterated by other shelter workers, something women would definitely never do. One police officer recalled watching a man through a window punch himself in the face in order to set up his partner. Again, something women would never do.
That's what Marky Mark does. He does that, and then oh shit! And then the cops come in, and and then the police think that William Peterson, the guy from CSI, she means business. She means business.
A common sentiment across all respondents was that men had become savvy, the words of the authors, not mine.
I'm Captain Jack Sparrow. Savvy.
Of the ins and outs of the criminal justice system and manipulate women with threats and custody issues. Despite the ubiquity of this concern among this sample, it's somewhat confusing given that 75% of people arrested for DV are men and 80% of custodial parents in the US are women. So, if men really are trying to manipulate the system so frequently, they don't appear to be very good at it. If it seems difficult to fathom that men are the ones abusing the custody system, remember that the people who believe that are also the ones running said system. Seems it's hard to operate the panopticon with your head thoroughly up your own ass. Miller's third theme concerned experiences with the criminal justice system, of which several respondents were displeased, namely with the increases in co-arrests of both parties involved in an IPV call, with some believing that it was laziness on the part of the cops as it pushed the charging decisions down the block and into the courts, increasing the paperwork for the interviewees. Oh, how tragic for them to be forced to do their job. Work which, according to one shelter director, had become increasingly difficult as any domestic call required the officer to fill out huge amounts of paperwork. Although some felt the police were over-enforcing arrests, others noted that the police could be held liable if they didn't do something when called to a DV scene, and are often essentially forced to arrest the victim, not only because the violence has been mutual, but also because the officers are aware that it may be easier for the victim to gain connections through the justice system with an attorney if they are removed from the home and placed in a jail cell down at the precinct, even just for the evening, more or less in protective custody. In a roundabout way, arresting both parties may actually be beneficial for the victim, at least provided there's no children involved. Despite this, officers reported that they even apologized to women that they were arresting who had been involved in an incident where both parties were being violent. Not one police officer mentioned apologizing to a man. One shelter worker further indicated that it can be very difficult for the police to make snap judgments on who is the aggressor and who is the victim, as women often do tend to slap and scratch their partners, even if only in self-defense. Yet when both partners have injuries, how can a cop possibly determine who started it on the spot? Yet others still saw cross-arrest as unfair, as they believed men were often able to make bail more readily than women, and that women were less likely to have experiences with the criminal justice system as an offender. Although that perspective seems to be confirmation that women don't seem to get in trouble for this kind of thing. But regardless, the professionals interviewed believed this inexperience caused them to make poor legal decisions, including pleading guilty in exchange for getting into the first offenders program, a probationary sentence with a mandated 12-week treatment, and no jail time. I mean, I would think that's better than risking time in jail, but several of the respondents here believed it was dehumanizing for victims to plead guilty or accept a plea deal, even if the violence was mutual, because again, they generally tended to believe any violence that women enacted was justified. Shelter workers were also not in favor of guilty pleas, perhaps because, as one director stated, that 3/4 of the time when women went to court in these cases, they were dismissed or found not guilty. Well, case in point. At least according to these professionals' own reports then, there seems to be a bias towards females. Again, seeing them inherently as victims and wishing to bend the system to give them greater leniency. If hearing it from the mouths of those who work in the system isn't enough to illustrate the preferential nature of that system, after everything else we've looked at today, I don't know what the hell is. And on that very positive note, let's come to a few conclusions. Today, we looked at the experiences of male victims of DV and IPV, and how those experiences are similar and dissimilar to those of female victims. we saw that men are usually less willing to report abuse for a number of reasons, be it out of shame or out of concern for their partner, and that the social and cultural perceptions of what typifies masculinity makes those concerns well placed, as outside observers continually doubt that men even can be victims, instead seeing them as eternal perpetrators. When men do speak about their experiences, their words are often met with laughter, both from regular people and, most disturbingly, police officers, social workers, and even judges. When men seek help, there frequently are no services that will even see them, and it's common practice to redirect male victims to support groups for male batterers instead. Male victims often find themselves trapped in a situation wherein there is no social nor legal support for them, and many feel forced to take the only way out that they see is available, and it's a particularly dark way out. It is for all of the aforementioned reasons covered in this video that a public case like that of Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard is so important, if for no reason than because it gives male victims a voice to at least say, "I exist." The massive media attention that this trial has drawn likely exposed many people to the very concept of a battered husband for the first time, at least not in a comedic context. And while it is obviously terrible that anyone suffers from DV, there may be one small ray of hope in this scenario, in that shining a light on it may rouse those with their eyes still shut, even if just a little bit. But hey, what do you guys think? Do you think it's unmanly for men to be on the receiving end of IPV? Do you think that men get adequate help from the current legal and social systems in cases of IPV? What can we do to protect victims, both male and female? Let me know in the comments down below, and while you're down there, check out my sponsor, Brilliant, and some of their free courses on math and science. And if you liked the video, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe if you're not subscribed, and hit the bell for notifications. I want to give an enormous thank you to all of my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar for graciously funding these long and research-heavy videos, particularly ones like this that are kind of depressing to make. You guys and gals are amazing and make these projects a reality. If you want to see your name on the screen with these fine folks, you can find links to support also down in the description. Finally, there's a link down there to my merch store, which has new designs related to my new podcast that you can catch every Wednesday at 8:30 p.m. GMT, 3:30 Eastern Time on the Broken Crown channel with my co-host, Spoon. I want to thank you all so much for watching, and as always, dear friends, Altana Volt.